Why formation of conscience? The document usually referred to as faithful citizenship. And a number of years ago, when I started working for the Archbishop and I started talking about this particular document, he said, well, make sure when you talk about it, you talk about forming consciences for faithful citizenship, because that's what the bishops really want you to focus on forming consciences. And I thought I would start the conversation around conscience with a statement that appears in the introductory note. The document was redrafted in 2007. So the form we have of it now dates back to 2007, but in 2012, the bishops added this introductory note. And in the introductory note that you find this statement. This document does not offer a voter's guide, scorecard of issues, or direction on how to vote. So it's not a direction on how to vote. And I have friends of mine, regardless of where they're on the political spectrum, always kind of get frustrated. Well, why are the bishops telling me, shouldn't the bishop be telling me how to vote? No, they're not supposed to be doing that. They're supposed to be teaching you the church's teaching. So it's not going to be a direction about how to vote. But it does apply Catholic moral principles to a range of important issues. And then here's the money phrase. It warns against misguided appeals to conscience, to ignore fundamental moral claims, to reduce moral concerns to one or two matters, or to justify choices simply to advance partisan, ideological, or personal interests. In short, it calls Catholics to form their consciences in the light of their Catholic faith, and to bring our moral principles to the debate and decisions about candidates and issues. So what do the bishops mean then by this phrase, misguided appeals to conscience? That's a pretty loaded phrase. And so how does that happen, and who does that? So I thought we'd just go into a short catechesis on conscience, based on the Catechism, with pictures and lots of things so we can better understand it, because I need those when I learn something. So let's first go to the Catechism. The Catechism, there's Jiminy Cricket, because it's basically that same idea. The conscience is that which tells you to do good and avoid evil. Okay? That's a nice summation. Your conscience is that part of your mind, your intellect, which tells you to choose good and avoid evil. Okay? And that you see that there in the Catechism. According to the Catechism, a human being must always obey a certain judgment of his conscience. If he were deliberately to act against it, he would condemn himself. And that's part of the Church's teaching, a long-held part of the Church's teaching. The great Blessed Cardinal Newman talks about this. St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this. You have to follow your conscience. You can condemn yourself if you don't follow your conscience. But the problem now that I'm going to introduce is that oftentimes Catholics stop there. They stop there. I've got my conscience, and I know what my conscience says, so that's all I need to know. And I just need to follow my conscience. And I go forward. There's more to the Church's teaching on conscience than just this phrase. Because, as Jiminy the Cricket tells us, faced with a moral choice, conscience can make either a right judgment, or in accordance with reason of divine law, or, on the contrary, an erroneous judgment can depart from that. In other words, your conscience isn't infallible. Your conscience can be spectacularly wrong. It can make huge mistakes. And we know this in our own lives. So I want to discuss first, well, how does that happen? And then how do we work against that? To do that, let me just explain briefly the way Aquinas and others have tried to explain what conscience is. You have a mind, and your mind is, let's say, divided between your intellect and will. Okay? The intellect receives information, and your will makes the choice to act. Okay? Now, your intellect is informed by a number of various things. Let's say information and conscience. Information goes through the conscience and gets to the intellect. Right? So the information comes in, the conscience says, this is good, this is evil, you should do this, and the intellect tells the will, hey, will, choose this, and the will does it. Right? And then you act. Now, when virtue is involved, sometimes the virtue comes in, and you're so used to doing the good thing, because you've had this information so many times, that you just go ahead and do it. Your conscience doesn't really have to get too involved in it, because you're just so used to doing the good thing, you just go ahead and do it. Right? Because a virtue is referred to as just a habit, a good habit. Okay? But what happens when you have a vice, which is a bad habit? That's all vices are. What happens when you have a vice? We have experienced this, I think, in our own lives too. What happens when you have a sin in your life that is so regular and you're so used to it that you can no longer even hear your conscience. Your conscience is yelling at you, Omar, stop eating that pie. It's a nice pie. It's great pie. Pie is good, but stop eating it. I can't. I just keep eating it. It's out of habit. It's a bad habit. I can't even hear my conscience anymore. So we need to be very careful that when we're hearing our conscience, we're actually hearing who it is. And sometimes the vice gets so bad that our conscience says it's actually a good thing. Or maybe our conscience isn't saying, maybe it's the enemy. Maybe the enemy is telling us, oh yeah, go ahead and do that. Or yeah, it's a bad thing, but that's not really bad. It's not a really bad thing. We have to be very careful about how we listen to our conscience. We need to be able to discern whether or not our conscience is telling us something real, or whether it's the enemy, or any number of various things. This is why the Catechism says this. It is important for every person to be sufficiently present to himself in order to hear and follow the voice of his conscience. This requirement of interiority is all the more necessary as life often distracts us from any reflection, self-examination, or introspection. Boy, isn't that true? Isn't that true? We get so distracted by the world and running kids to practices and meeting deadlines at work and checking up with friends on Facebook and all the rest of it, right? That we have very little time for interiority, for self-reflection. This is why the sacrament of confession is such a great gift to us. For those of you who read my column in the Catholic Voice, which was on voting this last time, and I mentioned, have we gone to confession recently? Shouldn't we go to confession before we try to go to the voting booth? Why? Why did I write that? Because vices exist in our life that can get in the way of our listening to our conscience, of our hearing what our conscience really has to say or ought to be telling us. But that's part of what it means to follow your conscience, is to make sure you have enough interiority, a graced interiority, so we can hear what our conscience is actually telling us, and make sure it really is our conscience speaking to us. So that's the first thing. The first thing is sometimes our vices get in the way. But here's another way that things can go wrong. Let's say we have our conscience, and the conscience is working fine. We're not talking about vice here at all, right? We have a certain situation, but the information we get is corrupt. Either through lies or bad information or laziness, or we just don't bother finding out the truth, we get bad information, and that happens. Right? People lie to us or give us bad information. The information we get affects how our conscience makes decisions. So that's why we need to make sure that the information we have is correct, is thorough, is balanced, let's say. That's extremely important. So this is why the Catechism says conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. A well-formed conscience is upright and truthful. It formulates its judgments according to reason, in conformity with the true good willed by the wisdom of the Creator. The education of conscience is indispensable for human beings who are subjected to negative influences, and tempted by sin, prefer their own judgment and reject authoritative teaching. Who doesn't do that, right? We all do that. I prefer my own judgment. I want to find my own. St. Paul has this great line in 2 Timothy chapter 4 where he talks, a time will come when people with itching ears will go find for themselves teachers to suit their own liking. I love that passage from St. Paul. We all do that. I don't like what the bishops are saying, so I'm going to go find Father so-and-so or this theologian or this writer or that news network to tell me that I'm really right. We all do that. We all do that. And, of course, this education of conscience is a lifelong task. You're never done educating your conscience, informing your conscience. From the earliest years, it awakens the child to the knowledge and practice, and prudent teachers teach virtue. The education of conscience guarantees freedom and engenders peace of the heart. It's a lifelong practice. And this is something, too, I've come up against. I've never had anybody come up to me and say, Omar, I have a bad conscience. Could you help me form my conscience? I just don't trust my conscience. That's never happened to me. I've had lots of people come to me and say, I've got a good conscience. I know I have a well-formed conscience. So I don't need to come to your talk this morning, Omar, because I know I have a well-formed conscience. Right? Now, I'm sure a lot of people do, and you don't have to necessarily be here, although I'm glad you're here, to have a well-formed conscience. But it's true, we tend to think already that we have a well-formed conscience. Why? Because you don't know you're wrong until you know you're wrong. I mean, we've all experienced that too, I think, to some degree, haven't we? Where I'm sure this is the right position, this is where I don't agree with the bishop is simply wrong on this, and then something happens, I read an article, or I meet somebody, hear a personal story, or something happens, and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I was really wrong. I was really wrong for a long time. Maybe those bishops maybe they're smarter than I think they are. So we have to constantly be educated, constantly be questioning and asking questions, and constantly be open to what the church has to tell us. And so how do we form our conscience then? The parents do it, teachers do it, our laws do it. This is why it's very important that we pass just laws, because if we have unjust laws, they teach us something about the dignity of the human person. We have laws against perjury. We can jail you if you lie about under oath about somebody's life or property. We'll jail you because we think that's really important. Life and property are important things connected to the dignity of the human person. So it's so important we will jail you. The fact that there's that law, it teaches us something about the dignity of the human person, about what we believe is a culture. And likewise, the fact that it's legal to kill your unborn child in this country at any point, for whatever reason, essentially, says something about what we think about human dignity. It says a lot. And it doesn't speak well for us. So that's a very important law. Culture. What does our literature say? What do movies say? What is our music like? That forms our conscience as well. We can start to begin to change the culture by not buying into some literature, music, and movies that are out there. Our friends form us, and our faith forms us. And this is where we get finally to this question. A Catholic conscience is to be informed by the teachings of the Catholic faith. You're always going to have a conscience. Everybody has a conscience. Every human being has a conscience. Right? Every human being has a conscience that tells them to do good or avoid evil. A Catholic conscience is one informed by the Catholic teaching of the Church. That's what distinguishes it from other consciences. To be informed. Now, at this point, we have this question about fidelity, right? Fidelity to the Church's teaching. What I usually like to say about this is, fidelity is not fidelity when we agree with the Church all the time. Right? I'm the best Catholic when the Church agrees with me. I'm a great Catholic. Olympic, really. I'm a fantastic Catholic when the Church agrees with me. But it's when I don't agree with the Church, like with bishops, that's where fidelity kicks in. That's when we have to say, all right, I need to trust that Jesus gave us a church that's teaching something true. And I need to be humble enough to at least listen and to research and to seek out, instead of just assuming that I've got it all figured out. You still have to follow your conscience. Remember, that's a rule. You still have to follow your conscience. But at no point in time should you ever, A, walk away from the sacraments, or B, simply stop listening. Stay with the Church. So that's what I think the bishops mean when they talk about misguided appeals to conscience. Right? My conscience tells me it's okay to do this or vote for that or support that policy, but it's not. You're not forming your conscience well. And you need to better form your conscience. All right. And that's what forming consciences for faithful